giờ hơn. Không căng thẳng nhưng thật ra bổ ích nha, bổ hay nha, đáng đi á. Có mấy có hình như có 2 cái topic là có một cái topic là sử dụng đúng cái mô hình này luôn.
Nice, thank you. It's very light. That's exactly right. Enjoy it. Thank you.
Dạ. Ủa không, mẹ nói ta là quá khó rồi cô, còn 2 cái rồi. Dạ bữa cô thấy dạ có 2 cái hình khung nhỏ nhưng mà ý là kêu người ta làm lại cái hình khung bự á mà không biết người ta quên. Không. Ý là mẹ nhắn thẳng cho cái chỗ làm hình á, họ kêu họ làm lại mà họ y như đúng rồi, hình bị lỗi cái răng của con, mà hình 2 chị em chắc nhiều khi mình phải sờ qua sờ lại. Tại bữa mẹ có nhắn tin bên chỗ studio thì họ kêu họ làm lại, xong mẹ hỏi là làm lại của đi hay sao, mày làm lỗi mà xong rồi y như cái gì. Còn giờ cũng không biết luôn, không trả lời rồi cũng không biết là sao luôn. Vì đó mình đúng rồi, họ xác nhận mà họ làm lại xong cái mày kêu làm lại free hay sao chứ mày lỗi mày xong rồi im, thôi kệ đi, mà tới giờ cũng biết sao nữa. Để mẹ gửi cái mẹ chụp cái hình cái đoạn tin nhắn này nhắn cho họ qua cho cô Thủy nha. Dạ.
Con bữa nào con mời lại.
Okay, so on to the afternoon work, and we did our last big block in the course on now economically founded models. Right, in contrast to, for sure, the AR, ARMA, ARIMA models that were really strictly time series models coming from the literature on stochastic processes, where we, of course, try to find the best fit for the series that we would be looking at, but otherwise couldn't claim that they were really economically motivated models. And the VR models, we had some economic implication to them, right? That we said, okay, we are thinking about which group of variables belongs together. We talked in the context of the vector correction models a bit about distinguishing short-term effects from long horizon effects, but none of those models so far really could claim, right, that they are rooted in economic behavior, households, firms, policymakers. And so that's where the last block of models is going to come in, to now look at models where indeed we give so-called micro foundations to the underlying economic models, micro foundations in the sense that we look at the problems of households, how do they decide about their supply, how do they think about consumption savings plans, we think about the problems of firms, how do they decide how much to produce, which factor inputs to use, more labor, more physical capital. We think also about the policy decisions, think specifically about the decisions of the monetary authorities, for the reason that at the end with these models we also want to forecast again the federal funds rate, right? And so we'll not put that much emphasis on fiscal policy, but we'll put some consideration at least into monetary policy, so that within the model the central bank is going to set its monetary policy rate, so that when we take the US data, we can also forecast the federal funds rate in the US data. Now, of course, in the advanced fundamentals of macro course, you did look already at such micro-founded models, specifically within that class of dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, the class of models that are so-called new Keynesian DSGE models, that is, have some people think of as Keynesian frictions, rigidities and prices, wages, right? That was one of the major themes of Keynes, that he said wages and prices are not fully flexible, but they are somewhat rigid and adjust only gradually over time. You have looked at such models, but what I have been told, and of course always, right, this is a matter of the source, which tells you things, how applicable it is, but I've been told that maybe that class of models isn't that much appreciated yet after the limited amount of time that also that course was available to cover it. If you now tell me, no, not at all, we feel we are true experts at these models, then I will not just skip this slide set, but skip the first 15 or so slides of the one on new Keynesian DSGE models. But let's see. Just stop me if you feel I'm just telling you old hats. But as long as you don't stop me, I think we might benefit from, before we go into the new Keynesian version of these models, to first kind of see a pure version of such models. Kind of the model style, you know, that Kittlin and Prescott in the mid to late 80s would be working on. And the whole thing is kind of coming out of a research program that was proposed by another Nobel laureate, Robert Lucas, who basically said, you know, when we look at these econometric models, such as, say, a VR or vector correction model, from his perspective, the problem would be that the parameters of these models would change if economic policy changes, because individuals, households, firms may adapt their behavior to economic policy. So he said we need models where the parameters are so-called deep or invariant parameters, such as the parameters in the utility function, in the production technology, that at least when we think about changes in monetary fiscal policy, may be presumed not to change, and therefore invariant, and so we don't run into the problem that when we do policy analysis, that the model parameters would change if the policy changes, but rather because if we have models, the so-called deep parameters, those parameters will not change as the policy becomes more expensive or more contractionary, and that was the main reason why that class of models was proposed by Lucas, I'd say in the mid-70s or so, but it took another 10 years before Goodman and Prescott really started off on that with a model that's at the time being taken serious by some, but also being heavily criticized by others. And that's my entrance into the core assumptions of this model, because as we now go through this list, if you had a good undergraduate intermediate macro course, and you look at these assumptions, you may say, oh my God, what kind of primitive model is this? You're taking us back to something that's much more elementary than intermediate macroeconomics. I don't think that will be the case, because in intermediate macroeconomics you don't have microfoundations, and you don't try to solve intertemporal optimization problems, put everything together in a stringent, coherent form, but rather say, oh, okay, well, that's a consumption function of households, that's an investment function of firms, motivate them a little bit, but never get everything within one coherent, stringent framework based on intertemporal optimization. So, bottom line is, as we go into this class of models, to keep this somewhat tractable, we have to make many abstracting assumptions. Some of those we will relax as we then go back into the new Keynesian DSGE model that will take to the data, but some will stay. And so, for example, one assumption that's going to stay throughout our discussion of such models here is that we looked at a closed economy. Is Vietnam a closed economy? I don't think so. Is the US a closed economy? I don't think so either. But for the US, probably it's correct to say that the relative importance of imports and exports of overall economic activity is not as large as it is for some other economies. And of course, these models originally were developed as to be realistic for the US economy. And so that's an assumption that's often maintained within this class of models, even with more complex structures. But of course, there's nowadays also open economy versions of these, where, for example, you model the domestic economy as a small open economy, or model, more global interactions among different economic blocks. But that's all beyond the scope of this course. We will look at the closed economy models, and our data is going to be primarily, of course, US data again. So again, for the US, this is probably not as bad an assumption as for some other economies. If you feel encouraged to take such a model class to Vietnam, then I would encourage you to study an open economy. And there is, if you're interested, the preliminary working paper version of a paper of Dr. Ha, two doctoral students of mine in Frankfurt and myself, where we have a new Keynesian DSGE model for Vietnam with a structure where the Vietnamese economy is interacting with the US, but also with the rest of the world, and Vietnam is embedded within this context into a global value chain. But that's a bit too much for this course, so we'll stick within this course to the closed economy assumption. We'll also stick to the no financial sector assumption, because that's again a huge assumption, and then specifically in the context of the aftermath of the global financial crisis, other financial advisors. Of course, there has been quite some effort to develop models that do incorporate the financial sector, incorporate financial frictions, but again, not the initial real business cycle model for sure, and also beyond the scope of this course. Quite typical of these models is that they do not model money, because in general, in macroeconomics, we have, I think, still a bit of trouble to motivate why people would use money in the form of currency, right? There is a so-called search theory. Why, when people have money, it facilitates selling, purchasing goods and services, in contrast to a barter economy, because in a barter economy, right, you always have to find a match. Who wants your good, who wants your service, and at the same time you want their good or their service, right? Then you have a match, and of course this match you don't need in an economy in which currencies in circulation, of course, more digital forms of payments, also an option for all that. But that's still a bit hard to motivate. Some people put money in the utility function. That's not entirely convincing, probably per se we don't get utility, right, either from money or having a smartphone with which we can pay. We get the utility from the good or service that we purchase, but probably not from the payment technology itself. So this is still quite common, but because, as we already have seen, right, in our models, when we think about central bank behavior, for sure for the US and many other economies, we don't need to think about how much money is in circulation, but we can think about the money policy. And so from that perspective, that's not going to be a crucial loss if those models don't have money in circulation in them. There's going to be no public sector because we're not going to be per se going to study fiscal policy, fiscal expenditure, taxation, and so on. Of course, if that's your interest, then add that to the model. There's a number, of course, of DSGE and Europeans and DSGE models that do have a government sector in that. Of course, particularly in the context of Vietnam, if you were to say, I have some specific aspect in mind of fiscal policy that may be different than elsewhere, that's again another opportunity to say I'm going to modify a DSGE model for Vietnam to bring in some more realistic fiscal institutions into the market. Couple more assumptions, and an assumption that's been perhaps among the most controversial ones for the business cycle, but also when you came to DSGE models, that they typically work with a so-called representative household. That is, we presume that the households are identical. Do the people who make that assumption really think households are identical? Of course not. Right? Nobody would argue that households are identical, but it's an abstracting, simplifying assumption. Right? If you kind of think there's one overall household who mimics in some way maybe the average or median behavior across different households. A somewhat more recent development in this literature are so-called heterogeneous agent New Keynesian models, so-called HANK models, and they have some household heterogeneity, but often also limited. You might say that some households are more patient, others are less patient, and then that affects, for example, issues as to also whether they are patient enough to acquire enough financial resources to acquire home ownership, real estate in general, whereas the more impatient ones are often called so-called cash in hand consumers, cash to mouth consumers, who basically just eat up whatever cash they have on hand and then don't think about saving or borrowing because they cannot borrow. Nobody would give them a loan because their income is too low or too unstable, and therefore they just eat up whatever income they have. Right? This kind of heterogeneity is now in there, sometimes in such models, but we'll abstract from it, work with the so-called representative infinite lived household, because nobody thinks household's life is infinite. This is kind of a simplifying way to bring in different generations of households, rather than modeling explicitly that the head of household may pass away, leave some bequests to the next generation, the next generation takes over. This is kind of just one household. It was all generations. Kind of like your parents would like you to be, just like that. And so this is kind of this model. Children are exactly like their parents, infinitely lived households. Households offer labor supply in perfectly competitive labor markets. We will have therefore fully flexible wages. And again, that's of course an assumption that's going to be dropped when we go to the Keynesian DSGE models, and we'll then also drop the assumption that the firms work in a perfectly competitive market, but for a real business cycle model, again, you have this concept of a representative firm, not because anyone thinks there's just one firm in the economy or all the firms are the same, a simplifying assumption. And those firms work in perfectly competitive product markets, so in particular, of course, the marginal cost of production is going to determine the price of the product in perfect competition, and of course has to be equal to marginal cost, and so that's going to be the basis for pricing in this model. When we go to the DSGE models, we'll see that firms can also run markets, but not in this RBC structure, the simple structure. Firms are in perfectly competitive markets. All right, so let's set up the optimization problems that we need to solve. Again, we have a large number of identical households, and if you look at the representative household, then that household is deciding about consumption, and NT is labor supply, hours worked, think of it literally as hours worked, and the household wants to set those across all of his or her lifetime. Suppose we think of this as starting in period 0, then the household wants to maximize the present discounted value of expected lifetime utility. Right? So what we're doing here is we're adding up across all those current and future periods in which the household lives. The household is infinitely lived, right? So this goes to infinity. We maximize the expectation of the discounted value. B does a discount factor. It's just saying how much do you discount utility in the future period relative to the current period. If the future period is t periods away from period 0, you discount by beta to the power. Right, so in any given period, if you were to get consumption now, it is per se more valuable than the same amount of consumption. Next period, if you were to receive that same amount of consumption next period, you discount the utility function. I'll talk about the functional form of this utility function in a second, but you discount that utility by the factor beta. So we expect that this is less than 1. Realistic parameterization is maybe 0.96 or something like that, so that you again discount everything else equal. If you receive something in the future, relative to that, that's less valuable. Right, so it's a bit like this example. If you put a child in a room and put a strawberry cake on the table, and you tell the child, I'm going to leave the room now, and I'm going to come back in half an hour. And if you haven't touched this strawberry cake in the half hour, I'll give you a second one. Right, and then what would you expect the child? First, say, hey, 2 strawberry cakes. Much better than 1, that's what I want to go for. Then a minute passes 2, and the child thinks, nobody's going to notice if I just do a little bit of a tasting, and then the taste is of course great, and it's going to take just a few more minutes before all that cake is in the child's mouth. Right? That's impatience. Because even if you were to be guaranteed 2 cakes, half an hour later, you cannot resist eating that 1 cake. Then you that's impatience, right? So that's this discount factor. Utility function in consumption. I would hope that you have seen such a functional form in microeconomics. This is a so-called constant relative risk aversion. C-R-R-A utility function, and again basically says if you think about risk aversion, that risk aversion is constant irrespective of the level of Growth is just the one parameter in such a functional representation for consumption. We have per se an additive formulation in consumption and labor hours, because labor hours are not per se enhancing your utility, except if you're within this course. Of course, you want to study more and think that gives you more utility. But outside of this course, I presume you would rather have leisure than hour, and that's what hours of work, and that's what the bottom pursues, right? So there's a minus side in front of it, right? Labor hours, of course, are evaluated negatively, and again, in this specification, come in that constant relative risk aversion functional form. If you say this is not something you recall, double check your slides on material, on advanced fundamentals of microeconomics, and if it's not in there, all over the microeconomic textbook literature, but so-called constant relative risk aversion functions. But the bottom line economically is that the degree of risk aversion that you have is independent of the level of consumption, or in this case, independent of the level of leisure, if you think of this as being the disutility from labor. Of course, it's the same as utility from leisure. Budget constraint. Of course, we need a budget constraint, otherwise you would just not work and maximize consumption to the infinite level. So we need a budget constraint. BT, obvious notation, hope is the price level. So on the left-hand side, you have the household's expenditure on consumption, and the household is going to be the owner of the firm. And so the household, if it wants the firm to have more capital stock available, also has to purchase investment goods. That's the idea, right? That the household is the owner of the firm, and therefore beyond consumption will also purchase investment goods, because if it purchases more investment goods, the firm that the household owns is going to have more capital stock and can produce more output. That's the mechanism. On the right-hand side, you have your sources of funds. So on any hour of work N, you're going to earn a wage W. So W times N is just your labor income. R times K is your income on the capital stock, right? So you could also say I hypothetically rent out that capital stock, and then you would rent out 1 unit of the capital stock in period T at rate capital R. So that's kind of the rental price of capital. The owners of the firms are the households, right? They own the capital stock, and either they kind of rent that capital stock to their own firm, but impute a cost to that, right? That rental price of capital, or they hypothetically could also rent it out to another firm, and then would get that rental paid on capital to rent out that capital stock to another firm for one period. DT is the dividends that the households are earning. Those will in the end be zero, because it is a world under perfect competition, right? We said before already the firms are operating under perfect competition. So just for completeness sake, initially would need to allow for dividends, profits that the households earn as the owners of the firm, but in the end, because the firms operate under perfect competition, the dividends that accrue to the household will have to be zero, right? Because under perfect competition, again, price is always equal to marginal cost. Under perfect competition, the firm doesn't earn profit. KT plus 1 is a capital stock at T plus 1, and 3 is just as it says under equation 3, a law of motion for capital. Right? Delta is the rate of depreciation. So the capital stock in T plus 1 is just the capital stock in the previous period minus the fraction delta of it that depreciates, plus any additional investment I. Right? So I is also of course the gross investment. Net investment would be IT minus delta times KT. That would really be a change in the capital stock. Now, how to solve this? Various ways. Later when we get to a more complex model, I'll actually do it without any formal means of optimizing across infinitely many periods. But here let's do the formal thing, and one formal thing to do is, of course, if you have an optimization subject to these equality constraints, of course I can reduce these two equality constraints into one, right? I could always plug back in from KT, from the law of motion of cap into the budget constraint, and I have reduced it to one constraint. So I have an objective function subject to one quality constraint, and I can set up a Lagrangian function, right, to maximize that. That's per se not affected by the fact that this thing is intertemporal rather than a static Lagrangian. You can, for practical purposes, treat this the same way. Of course, there's a long literature on making sure that in a temporal context, right, where you have periods, this is all well defined and so on, but for practical purposes, just think of it like as an aesthetic setting. But of course, it is an intertemporal problem because we go across all possible time periods, right? Both in terms of the utility function as well as, of course, in terms of the budget constraint. And you've seen this budget constraint. I've already plugged in kt plus 1 minus delta times kt for investment. Right? IT is equal to kt plus 1 minus delta times kt, and that's already plugged in. I've already plugged in from 3, solving 3 for IT into 2, and that gives me the term inside the square brackets, following the Gaussian multiplier. Right? This is again pt times ct, but I've plugged in for pt times it, pt times kt plus 1 minus pt times 1 minus delta times kt. Right? That's just plugging in for IT. Law of motion of the capital stock, and then of course we subtract from that the wage income, the capital income, and the dividends. All right, take the first order partials of this Lagrangian first with respect to C at time t. Right? C at time t only enters within the sum at time t. Right? Not in any other time period. So taking this partial here, of course, this is 1 minus rho divided by 1 minus rho times ct to the power minus rho minus lambda t times pt. Right? That's the term from there. That has to be equal to 0. Secondly, the partial of this Lagrangian with respect to labor hours in each period has to be 0. That gives us from the utility function this term in nt to the power of phi. Of course, per se times minus 1, but I bring in this minus 1 by making out that minus lambda t w2e plus lambda wt. Finally, the Lagrangian with respect to the capital stock holdings. Differentiate here with respect to kt plus 1. Then at time t, we have a minus lambda t pt, right? That's the first term. And now, of course, see that we also have the capital stock in terms of timing at time t. So that's going to show up in the next period after t. That's going to become a t plus 1. Right? So the next period is, of course, discounted by beta, is subject to uncertainty. So we take the conditional expectations operated at time t off. These terms here shifted one period forward, right? And it's lambda t plus 1 times pt plus 1 times 1 minus delta. And the second term is that I'm also shifting, have to shift this kt one period forward. So this is a lambda t plus 1 times rt plus 1. Of course, all of that within the conditional expectations operated, because again it refers to period t plus 1 from the perspective of period t. Right, so those are my first order conditions. Now, let's combine them to get optimally conditions that we can use for the model. First thing is if we combine 5 and 6, right? Obviously both in 5 and 6, we have the Lagrangian multiplier lambda t. So if I solve out one of those for lambda t, I plug back in the other equation, I get my optimality condition for labor supply in 8. That is in ct to the power of rho times nt to the power of phi. Right? That's coming obviously from the left-hand sides of 5 and 6. and that has got to be equal to normal wage, W divided by the price level. That is on the right-hand side, you have the real wage, right? What is the benefit from giving up 1 hour of leisure and working 1 hour longer? You have what is the market price for that on the right-hand side, the real wage, and you equate that to your individual preferences. Right? Basically, the term on the left-hand side tells you if I am to work 1 more hour, how much extra consumption do I require in order to be indifferent? Right? And the argument, of course, that exchange of leisure for 1 more hour of labor, how much extra consumption it gives you in terms of the market price, WTO repeating and the real wage, matches your preference as to how at which way you're willing to exchange labor for consumption. Right? That's the left-hand side, your difference relation between working 1 hour more or less in terms of the extra consumption you require or are willing to give up if you have 1 more hour of leisure, and that has to be equal to the market price. That's your labor supply. Right? You optimize up to that point where you have reached that point where you exactly in terms of the real wage compensated for your preferences, what you require to give up 1 additional hour of leisure in terms of extra consumption according to your preferences. E matches preferences to the market price that you obtain for 1 additional hour of work, giving up 1 hour of leisure. Now, if you combine the partial with respect to consumption, with respect, combine that with the partial with respect to the capital stock. I'd solve 5 for lambda t. Clearly, what is lambda t? It is ct to the power of minus rho divided by pt. Plug that in to 7. Then this pt cancels out here, cancels out, of course, over there as well, because lambda t plus 1 is equal to ct plus 1 to the power of minus rho divided by pt plus 1. So this pt plus 1 cancels out. And what is left? An expression in the marginal utility of consumption in period t. First term. And second term is a marginal utility in the consumption in t plus 1. How to interpret this optimality condition? It basically says, if I was to give up 1 unit of consumption today, right, this measures my disutility from giving up 1 marginal unit of consumption today. Then what can I do? If I don't consume that unit anymore, I can instead purchase the investment. Right? I purchase IT instead. And if I purchase IT, I'm going to have a larger capital stock next period. That's going to allow me to produce more, and therefore will, beyond the savings needed to purchase that investment, will allow me to increase the amount of consumption next period. Right? It's a bit like our example of that child. After half an hour, you get 2 cakes if you're willing to wait. And so that's like you do. Right? If you're willing to give up consumption in period T, you demand a return on it. And that means you have to have more consumption, right? Because you discount consumption next period. You're never going to take a trade-off where you would say, I'm just going to get the same amount of consumption next period as what I'm giving up now. You need a compensation because you're inflation. Right? And that compensating factor is exactly here on the right-hand side. Right? It is in basically that rate of return on capital in real terms. Right? Capital R divided by P is just the real rental rate on capital, and then remember, however, if you're the owner of the capital stock, it depreciates. Right? The larger delta, the less of return you get. So overall, in the curly brackets, you have this return that you get on purchasing 1 additional unit of capital, how much more you can produce, or what is return on that unit of capital next period. You have the marginal utility of consumption, T plus 1, and you discount it back. So the Euler equation says you are indifferent between consumption now and next period, because if you were to give up some consumption now, the extra consumption that you get next period is just exactly the extra amount of consumption that per utility function you require. Right? And that's your difference, because beta times C equals 1 to the power minus rho. That's you're compensated for the fact you're discounting by additional extra consumption, so that they're exactly indifferent between consumption now and next period. That's the so-called Euler equation of consumption.
I think like NOC in number 5 and number 6 from the previous slides is missing something. They will miss the beta and the number 6 like minus and.
But you also have a minus lambda t. Let's check carefully.
Yeah.
Of course, per se, there's no doubt. If you take this part, there should be a minus in front of it.
Yeah, yeah. So
But then I have a plus. Yeah, that's a plus.
yeah. It should be minus so that you can come up with the 8.
But I think what I want here is, I think I switched back a bit back and forth in my thinking. You know, on whether the Lagrangian multiplier comes in with a plus sign or with a minus sign. I wrote this here with a minus, and I think I'm consistent here, of course, right? This is correct, that this is the marginal utility of consumption minus lambda t is equal to 0. And so if I use that, then I have to have here also a minus sign in front of it. I think I was just switching back and forth, you know, between the setup where you have here a minus or plus. Of course, you can read them all, right? You can also just add that Lagrangian multiplier constraint to it. That's your choice, which way you do it. So I guess when I wrote this down, I had in mind that I have a plus lambda t, and so that should be now a minus. Because that also then changes
Yes.
8, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I need a minus sign here as well.
I don't know.
Correct?
You don't need to have it. I'm going to show you. Like, you can go back to the one slide before that.
Well, I think I closed my whole slide set, so 1 second. I have to reopen that. Now I just lost that change that we just made.
Yeah, the next slide. Yeah,
First
this
again, I
one.
need to
Yeah.
bring in this minus sign, right?
Yeah.
No doubt about it.
But we also need
Ah,
to have the beta thing, I guess. The beta over there. It should go with the C and okay. The beta T also.
But this only enters in one period, right? So you also, of course, in terms of evaluating future periods, maybe this is a bit in the matter again of how I set brackets. You discount future utility relative to the constraint, right? So this beta here would cancel out, but here it remains, right? Because it refers to 2 different time periods. Right? That's why the beta is here, but not there.
So you start with the 20 0.
Yeah.
Okay. But the 8 is correct.
So this minus, but this you say doesn't lead to a minus in 8.
Yeah, because you can see
Yeah.
that from number 5, like you can.
I have a minus in 8, right?
Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
like you can
Yeah.
show it.
I was just thinking for a second. You said I don't need a minus in 8, but if I have it in 5, I need to do this.
Oh, no. No more.
No. Okay, I need to go back. Let me check the other one. Okay,
You
so
can switch this over here. You can
of
switch
course
it
it's all
over here.
for this lambda.
Yeah.
You bring it back in here.
You can, I mean, like you can put it here. This one, like you can. The end will become this. C C will equal to this.
Then that is ct to the power minus 1 divided by pt.
Yeah, so no more.
So this is a plus,
yeah.
right? And then you bring this to the other side, this is minus and this minus.
Yeah, cancel out, right?
Okay. All right. Everyone in agreement? Yeah, I was just missing, sorry, in 5, but the rest is fine. Okay. Everyone's happy about the Euler equation procedure, right? The intuition for the Euler equation. All right. So then we come to the firms. Now, for the firms, of course, per se, they would also intertemporally optimize. But for the firms, this is simplified by the fact that we have a production function that in period t is a function of a so-called, what this literature calls a technology shock. Now, if you look at equation 11, what is that technology shock AT? The first order regressive process, right? So from the terminology that we had in our time series models, what is the shock? Epsilon t. But in this real business cycle literature, you call the technology shock AT. Right? We know it's not really a shock, it's really an AR1 process. But let me stick to the terminology in that literature, and then they call this AT, or the log of AT, the technology shock. But again, once more, the true shock is really an epsilon t, right? And AT itself is a first order regressive process. And then the production function, there's standard, has the capital and the labor, and here we have a Cobb-Douglas production function, right, in the capital and labor hours. And so what our firm is going to do, they maximize profits. And what are profits? Profits are the amount produced times the price at which you can sell, the amount of output produced minus the cost of production. What are the costs of production? Your wage bill, wage times labor hours, and your implicit bill, at least, on the capital stock. Right? If you think for simplicity of the firms as renting the capital stock, we said the rental rate on the capital stock is nominal RT, and so the bill on employing the amount of capital KT that the firm faces is RT times KT. Right, and so now you see this is per se a static problem. Right? You can reduce that to a fully static problem with a simplifying assumption that we have made that we can think of the firms as renting the physical capital. You could work with the whole thing with the firms purchasing the capital stock rather than renting it from the household. Right? I said the households own the firms because this is a bit of a construct. Right? That the households per se rent the capital stock to themselves because they're the household and the firm. But if you don't think through it that carefully, just say you're the household, you're the firms rent the capital stock from the household, and so that's a much simpler, tractable framework than to say let the firms purchase the capital stock in T at some price, and then they resell it in T plus 1 at another price, but they're going to get the same type of implications from a model where it's a more complicated setup where the firms purchase and resell the capital stock than if they rent it. So we go for that simple assumption that they just did. First order conditions. You're with me, right? You double check all the time whether I have any typo in there. So first with respect to the capital stock, alpha times the technology stock times k to the power alpha minus 1 times n to the power 1 minus alpha times pt minus that rental rate. And capital, and for labor correspondingly, right, of course, the marginal product of labor post multiplied by the price at which output is sold minus the nominal wage, right? Because the first term nominally, then the second term nominally as well. So those are our two optimality conditions with respect to capital stock and labor. Now, if we rearrange those optimality conditions in 13 and 14, what are we going to get? If I was to bring in 13 and 14 the last term to the right-hand side each, and then divide 13 by 14 or 14 by 13, right, then you see that a lot of the stuff from the conductor's production function cancels out. And that's exactly what we've already used in 15 and 16, that the optimality condition with respect to the capital stock, you can rewrite as one where we have on the left-hand side the real rental price on capital equal to the output capital ratio multiplied by the share of capital in production, and the second one, right, is the real wage equal to the share of labor in production, 1 minus alpha times the output labor share. This is not the final result yet, so let's not interpret it too much. What we want to do with that now is we want to derive how much demand does the firm have for physical capital and labor. And that's going to be in 18 and 19. How do we get there? Well, if we now combine also 15 and 16, right, you have that the real wage is equal to plugging in from 15 into 16 for YT, right? So 15 for YT. YT is equal to KT times the real rental price of capital divided KT, bring it to the other side, is alpha times YT divided by the real rental price of capital. Right? I plug that back into 16, and that gives me that the real wage is, of course, a function of the amount of labor supplied and transacted in the labor market. I can solve that for labor as a function of the amount of capital that's transacted in the market for physical capital. And if you plug that equation 17, right, that still has your two-factor inputs, labor and the capital stock. If you plug that back into the production function, remember 10 was the production function, right? If you plug that back into the production function, you have eliminated the labor hour surplus expression, and you obtain the demand for capital in a pretty intuitive form, I would say, in 18. Right? Think about 18, it says you demand more capital, the more output I want to produce. Makes sense, right? Everything else equal, if I want to produce more output, I need also more physical capital. If 80 is higher, why do I need less physical capital? Because if 80 is higher, you produce more productively. If you produce more productively, you need less effective inputs. Then we have this term in W, right? The higher the wage, the more you'd use in your production physical capital rather than labor, right? So the higher the wage, the more you demand for physical capital because you don't want to hire as much labor anymore. And then RT, of course, is the rental price in capital. The higher the rental price in capital, the lower your demand for physical capital because it's more expensive to employ physical capital in production. Similar thing then arises if you plug 18 back into 17 to basically eliminate from 17 KT, right, so that we can solve 17 just for NT. Can you interpret this? Does this make sense? The more output I produce, the more labor I need, everything else equal. The more productive the firm produces, the less labor input it needs, the higher the wage. Notice now this is a minus alpha, right? Before it was a positive term in the exponent, now it's a negative term, so of course that means the higher the wage, the less labor I will hire. And the other way around, the higher the rental price of physical capital, the more labor I will hire because now labor is cheaper relative to physical capital. Okay, so these are our demand functions for the capital stock and for labor. Getting there, almost, a couple more equations. So we need the price, right? We still need to solve for the price. The price is an endogenous variable, but under perfect competition, what must be the price? It must be equal to marginal cost. Marginal cost we get pretty quickly, because if we just differentiate total cost with respect to producing one more additional unit of output, that's going to give us marginal cost. Right, so to specify total cost, we have our two-factor inputs, labor and physical capital. Labor is getting the wage W. Capital is getting the rental rate capital R. Just add that up on the basis of our demand equation. So I just plug 18 and 19, plug those expressions for K and N that we have in 18 and 19. Please plug them into 20. Maybe you can't see it right away, but I assure you that the last expression on the right instead of 20 is right, except perhaps for a small typo. That doesn't change the quantitative interpretation. The qualitative interpretation is going to be right, because what does it say again? Right? Think about it intuitively. The more output I produce, the higher cost of production. The more productive I am, everything else equal, the lower the cost of production. If I have a higher wage, I'll have a higher cost of production. If I have a higher rental rate on physical capital, I'm going to have a higher cost of production. So I think it's right, but if some alpha or so is off, I'm sure I'm going to get an alert that this needs correction, but qualitative this is right. I think also the expression is right. All right, so now differentiate with respect to y, right? To go from total cost to marginal cost. So if I differentiate with respect to y, of course this is just all the rest that I have here on the right-hand side, right? Because that's multiplying y. 1 over 80 times the term in wages times the term in the rental rate on capital. That's my marginal cost. And again, under perfect competition, it must be that marginal cost is equal to price. And that gives me my price level. So now I know what price other firms are charging for the goods and services that they produce. Equation for the price level. And then finally, to round it out, if up to this point you were to count, how many optimality conditions do we have? 1, law of motion of capital. 2, labor supply. 3, Euler equation. 4, production function. 5, technology shock. 6, demand for capital. 7, demand for labor. 8, price level. And now count the number of variables. Output, consumption, investment, 3, price level 4, capital stock, labor hours 5, 6, wages 7, rental rate on capital 8, which one I'm forgetting? It must be 9. Because 80, right? I'm including in the system 80, right? So that's my 9th variable. So I need, of course, 9 equations for 9 variables. If I had included 29, however, I only have 8 equations for 9 variables. So there must be a 9th equation. Where is it coming from? The simple macroeconomic accounting identity. I think about national income and product accounts. According to the expenditure approach, what is an economy's level of output? In the default expenditure approach, output is equal to consumption demand, investment demand, capital expenditure, plus the trade balance. Well, we have a closed economy. We have no public sector. So what is the identity from the national income board accounts? 2 users of output, consumption, and investment, right? And that's basically just equating output produced, aggregate supply, to output demanded in the form of some energies. And that gives me my 9th equation, right? So I have 9 equations in 9 variables to solve for. That sounds right. That should give us a good chance to get some sensible solutions. Okay, now what I think you already learned in Aliasa's course is that in order to bring these equations to the data, of course, per se at this point, these equations are nonlinear. Right? For example, if I just look at the price level, that's a nonlinear function of wages, a nonlinear function of the rental price of capital, a nonlinear function of technology. Nonlinear functions and systems of nonlinear functions are much harder to solve than linear ones. Of course, also all of our time series models are all linear. The R is linear, R is linear, Rima is linear, VR is linear, vector all linear models. Right? So from that perspective, also to have an equal footing, we would want to have a linearized version of these non-linear optimality conditions. How do you get that? In 2 steps. In the first step, for each and every one of our 9 variables, you calculate the steady state. The steady state in such a model is simply obtained by equating time subscripts across all time periods. Right? So if, for example, I think about, take one equation, take, say, the law of motion of capital. I equate the capital stock in T plus 1 to the capital stock in T. Right? What is the steady state level of investment? Delta times the steady state level of the capital stock. That is, in the steady state, I simply replace each and every period that amount of capital that depreciates. My gross investment, I in steady state is delta times K, steady state. So my net investment in steady state is 0. I don't invest anymore, right? Because I'm in steady state, things stay where they are. They don't change. That's one example, right? And so you do that across all of our 9 optimality conditions. Set T equal to T minus 1 equal to T plus 1, solve for these 9 variables, then you get the so-called steady state levels. What you will see is, I mean, one thing that's obvious to show, right, if I think about our technology shock equation, what would happen if I said 80 equal to 80 minus 1? I have 1 minus rho times the log of A cancels out against this term here, right? So this is needing normalization. I need a normalized steady state. And so we define that to be equal to 1. And what's not so obvious to see, but just work through solving all these variables for steady state, the price level 2 is not going to be uniquely pinned down. You need to normalize it. And so we will also normalize the price level 2. Now those are the model equations. Take stock before we take this now into Dynea. Our next step will be to take this into Dynea for specific parameter values, see what learnings we can have macroeconomically from, for example, saying, let's suppose there's a technology shock. How does it change all of our macroeconomic variables? How does it change labor hours? How does it change consumption? How does it change output? And so forth. What I'd like you to be aware of, right, is that if you take now beyond the algebra, a view at what is this model substantive? The model says we are working in a world of perfectly competitive markets, prices for products, wages that are earned in production are fully flexible. We are in a world where there's just one shock, right? Namely that shock to technology. And so what the macroeconomy does respond to is to changes in the level of technology. That's what we want to trace out. And if you said, this is a business cycle model, what would it be? A model where you have ups and downs of log A, right? Because the shock to log A can be positive, can also be negative. You have ups and downs in the log of A, because this doesn't mean that productivity is negative, right? We take the log. But productivity can improve, productivity can deteriorate. And so what this model would say, the whole business cycle is a response to technology shocks. When technology improves, what would you intuitively expect? When technology improves in such a model. Before we go to any calculation of responses in linear, if technology improves, per se, the firms, right, produce more productively. Now remember, the households supply labor to these firms, and we had, of course, thought about the labor supply. Labor supply now depends on the real wage. Like we said, the price is normalized to 1. So the core question is what happens to the nominal wage, if you think about households labor supply. And what happens to the nominal wage? Well, let's try to find the relevant relationship in the demand for labor. Right? This is going to equate to the supply for labor. 19 is going to equate to the supply thereof. Now, if firms produce more productive, operate under perfect competition, do not earn profits, they have a more productive technology. They'll produce more output, given labor, given capital. So what's going to rise as well? The wage. Right? Because the firm produces more because it's more productive. It produces more with an existing amount of labor, given amount of capital. It doesn't collect profits because it's operating under perfect competition. So where is that additional production distributed to? At least in part to the workers to get a higher wage. Right? Because you produce more for a given amount of labor input, given amount of capital input. So the firm earns more, and if it still has to have zero profits, it must distribute these additional earnings to the inputs, to production, to labor, and to physical capital. Right? And so the wage goes up. So the wage goes up. What do you do as a household if your wage goes up? You work more. Right? You're now willing to give up some leisure. You say, if I work no more in this very productive environment, I'm going to earn more. If you know this is a shock to technology in the form of 11, a shock to epsilon. If this is a first order VR where rho is an absolute value less than 1, is that shock infinitely lived or temporary? If it's an AR1, A is mean reverting, so the shock is temporary. Right? So temporarily we have higher productivity, I better work more when I'm more productive. And how do you compensate for it in terms of leisure? Have more leisure when productivity is better. Right? So you know that because you earn a higher wage, you want to work more now. This further enhances, of course, production. But you also, because you are intertemporally optimizing as a household, Right? Where's our intertemporal optimality condition? It's in the Euler equation. Right? Of course, you shift now also your consumption savings plans, but at the time when the productivity goes back down to the original level, the wage will again fall back to its original level, then it's better to take more leisure. Right? And so you intertemporally substitute, work more in times when the economy is more productive, when the higher wages paid, and enjoy more leisure when the activity is lower. That's the main mechanism of a real business cycle. So it basically says the whole economy responds to these productivity shocks. If you have a positive productivity shock, you get more output produced simply because of production technology, but that also means you can earn higher wages. As you earn higher wages, that further strengthens the extra amount of output that is produced. You can afford more consumption and so on. But all of that gradually reverts back because those shocks to technology are temporary. So your productivity goes back to its original steady state level. Right? And in that process, you'll then want to enjoy more leisure again. And so that's going to be intertemporal substitution. More labor now, less labor in the future. I work more when I'm more productive. I work less when I'm less productive. That's the mechanism of this model. Now, when this model was first published, one of the many economists who jumped on this model was Larry Summers. Maybe you've heard his name. Larry Summers was not just an economist at Harvard, that he was for most at the time when he made this comment that I'm going to tell you about in a second. But later he also became the US Secretary of the Treasury. He was on the Council of Economic Advisors for US administrations, Democrats, so must have been Clinton and Obama. In those two administrations, he was in senior positions in economic policy making. At some point, he's also the president of Harvard. And if you haven't known him yet from that description, if you ever watched this movie about Mark Zuckerberg. And Mark Zuckerberg is the founder of Facebook. And of course, he founded that, maybe not completely literally, I don't know the exact details on that, but he started his work on Facebook at least when he was a student at Harvard. And at least in the movie, and I think it's true, he started that work because there were two twins, also students at Harvard, who asked him to program up, a directory of students so that students could easily get in touch with each other. He did that, and then I guess recognized that actually has a lot more potential than just a directory among Harvard students that can connect people much more globally. And so he made this a big business, as you all know now, right? He made this Facebook and Meta and all of that. And the two twins, of course, were pissed, can I say that? Very upset, if you think this is not an academic word, because they said, that's our idea. So in the movie, where do the twins go? To the president of Harvard University, Summers. So he's in that movie because an actor is playing him, and they go to him, and that's a very famous scene in that movie because Summers basically says, get a life. You're Harvard students, you can have many other things. So Summers completely dismissed them. But of course we also know, and that's also portrayed in the movie, that then these twins sued Zuckerberg, and later on I think Zuckerberg had to pay millions as compensation to those twins. Right? So that's at least meet Larry Summers in the movie. Now back to this thing here. What was Larry Summers' comment on this model? Beach ball sales don't go up in a recession. How is that connected to what I just said? beach ball sales don't go up in a recession. So in this model, right, again, if you have a technology shock that is enhancing productivity, again, people work more. Because these are relatively good times to work, you work in more productive times. And therefore, the other way around, when productivity falls, you work less. You take more leisure time in recessions. So according to that, if you take more leisure time in recessions, hit the beach. At least in America, I don't know the beaches here. In America, I guess one of the things that they sell on the beaches are beach balls, right? So that you can play ball on the beach. So some have said, well, if that's true, people work less in less productive times. They hit the beach more in less productive times. Everything that's sold on the beach must have a heyday when people are hitting the beach because we're in a recession. Of course, that's not typically true. Right? When we're in a recession, people buy less, pretty much of everything. They take also less holiday, and if they're on holiday, they spend less. Right? That's obviously not true. I say obviously not true without data, but you collect data and try to show that beach ball sales go up in a recession. I don't think you'll find evidence of that. So Summers is right on that. Now, of course, whether you want to interpret the model that literally, right, that's another question. And nonetheless, of course, it does say that maybe this model is too reliant on one mechanism, that intertemporal substitution of labor, that the whole business cycle would be driven by intertemporal substitution of labor. That seems a bit of a strong statement. Right, and that's why later we will go beyond the RPC model to models where there are other reasons why an economy may hit a recession. Right, that these can also be demand-driven, that there's simply a negative shock to ag demand that's going to set off a business cycle, like our undergraduate models. Right, they're typically in ISLM, ISTR, ASAD, whatever you call it, all demand-driven business cycles. There's less demand for firms' products, therefore they produce less because there's less demand for their products. As they produce less, they hire less labor, the people earn less, and as they earn less, they demand even less on that count. And as they demand even less, demand falls further, the firms further down, just the kings in mind. Right? That's the undergraduate macro market story. It's a completely different story. Technology shock. It's supply side, right? It's supply side shocks that drive the business. And it seems a bit too narrow, right? Really seems a bit too narrow to say that's a realistic model of business cycle. And that's where later on then these New Keynesian DSGE models came in and said, we also need to have demand shocks. We need to have rigidities on wages and prices, and that's why we're going to go as soon as we have looked at this model quantitatively for a few minutes, we'll go into New Keynesian DSGE models, and that's I think what you then used as a starting point again in the advanced fundamentals of macro course as a starting point for these microeconomic models. But if you really want to appreciate where they come from and what they try to fix up, important to come from the business cycle. Because at the core, these New Keynesian DSGE models contain this model, but they just add a lot of friction so that you also get demand shocks into the model. But the core structure comes from such a real business cycle model, and that's why I think it's important to know about such a real business cycle model, and then see that the New Keynesian DSGE model is a response to that and further tries to improve upon this real business cycle model by bringing in demand shocks, bringing in frictions on wages, prices, and so forth. All right, so if you just let me continue a few more minutes, because then I can wrap up my discussion of the business cycles. But no more algebra. Sit back, relax, and enjoy dynamic. So on the course website, I have also posted 2 two files. One is a MATLAB file, main_rbc.m, and one is a so-called Dynea file, rbc.mod, the counterpart of an M file or a U file. In MATLAB or Stata in Dynea is a mod file, MOD. So you see I have MATLAB open, and before we do any further work on these files in particular, what I have done already here is I have downloaded Dynea. The default when you install Dynea is that it's going to go into the C root drive, into a Dynea subdirectory, the latest version 6.3. So I have all my Dynea files on C Dynea 6.3. That would be the default. Also, if you download from the Dynea website the executable file, executed, that's where it would go. If it's allowed to go there, of course you can change the directory where it's installed, but remember into which directory it's installed. I'll show you the second one. You have to remember that directory, and then within that directory you also have a subdirectory map. And this subdirectory, within your installation of Dynea, you first have to add in MATLAB to the so-called path of MATLAB. So in MATLAB, if you have opened it up, at the top you see this menu, Home, right? And you also have several others, including an editor. That will also use those are going to be the main views, but go to the Home view. And in the Home view, you have this icon, Set Path. This is basically like in Stata, when we did the CD, change to this or that, change to that. In MATLAB, you use so-called path, and all the directories that you want to call upon in executing commands in MATLAB have to be part of this path. So what you see here is I have already added lots and lots of Dynea directories. Not all manually, but if you are simply in that set path window, click on Add Folder to Path, and then please make sure, by the way, do not use the second option. Do not use the option Add with subfolder. Just say Add Folder to Path. Then what you want to do is navigate your way to the C Dynea, in the latest version 6.3, subdirectory, and there map, and say, this is the directory that you want to add. So I don't want to click on it here because I may get into some conflict because I've already added it to the path. I don't want to have conflict messages. But that's all, because all you need to do. Right? Once you have installed the Dynea, you need to add the path within MATLAB to this MATLAB subdirectory within your installation of Dynea. Otherwise, it's not going to execute any Dynea command. So that's the first step you would need to take, please. The second step is that you also need to add that subdirectory where you have the files that I have on the course website. And so if you scroll down here a bit, after all this Dynea stuff, this is just automatically expanded, right? If you click on selecting that subdirectory where we have the MATLAB portion of the Dynea installation, it's going to add all these elements to the path up to here. That's going to be done automatically. The one subdirectory that you would please also add to the path is where you put the files from the course website. I have put them into C MATLAB ATMF25. If you put them somewhere else, choose that other directory. But for simplicity, so that you don't have to add that many different directories to your path, I would suggest choose one and then add them. And if you want to do it exactly like me, so that you don't have to worry about any application, just put those MATLAB files into C MATLAB ATMF25. Otherwise, again, if you have these files, MATLAB will not do anything because it's not going to search across all subdirectories on your device Say, there it is. MATLAB doesn't do that. It only searches in that path that we have specified, nowhere else. And I think that's good per se, right? So you don't lose a lot of time before it finally has found your file that you want to execute, but on the other end, of course, it's a cost, right? Because you first have to add any directory that contains MATLAB files to the path. If you have the same MATLAB file in two subdirectories, the ordering of this path matters. Now, Danair wants to be at the top. Don't ask me why, but that's something I would definitely follow. I'll put Danair at the top. But then afterwards, think about the ordering, right? And if you have the same M file in different subdirectories, it's going to pick the first subdirectory in which that M file is located. So in case of doubt, don't add too many subdirectories. Otherwise, it might execute the file from another subdirectory than the one you have in mind, and maybe an old version, right? Rather than the new version that you have in mind. So I personally, before I do work in MATLAB, I also, of course, remove some of these paths. Right? Once you have it in there, if you click on it, you can certainly also remove these subdirectories. So I keep that relatively parsimonious, because otherwise, probably only a matter of time before we have the same file name in two different directories, and it will be executed from a different directory than you had in mind, not the version of that file that you had in mind. Okay, all right. So that's setup work. Now let's first look at the Danair file. That's on the course website. Again, this is a so-called mod file. And by the way, if in MATLAB you want to open such a mod file, maybe I should mention that too to help you save some time. If you click on File Open, right, and I say I go to my ATMF25 subdirectory, you don't see the mod file, but it's there. MATLAB, it's commercial software. Any commercial software only wants to use its own files, right? And so you have to push MATLAB to also search for files that are not proprietary MATLAB files, and so you have to, in that directory here, go to All Files, right, and now you see RBC as well. So when you open these mod files, please make sure that you don't say, it's not there, and keep downloading it 100 times, and despair that it's there, but it doesn't matter if it's not there. You need to make sure that you augment the file dimensions that MATLAB is searching for. Of course, I have it still already open. Right, so let's look at it. The percentage sign is just a comment. Per se, these mod files, they don't have different colors for different types of elements of the mod file. It's just all black and white. So not like in Stata, that these comments now would be in green. You'll also see that in M file in a second. And there too, we have these different color schemes, so it makes it easier. But the mod files, they're all black and white. Right? Because it's just an add-on, Danair, and of course, MATWorks, the producer of MATLAB, doesn't give the Danair people the permission to enter its own intrinsic editor. Okay, so that taking into account, what do we do in this mod file? To get this RBC model into Danair and then execute it within MATLAB. General steps for defining a model in Danair. First, we define the endogenous variables. Again, the percent sign is just a comment, so VAR is not a vector order regression, but it's variables in Danair. You define your endogenous variables. I usually have the same notation as in the slide, so this is capitalized, right? Because you can also use lowercase letters, that's up to you. The exogenous variables have to come separately, right? Var exo, and that's of course the shock to technology. That's exogenous. Technology is a function of that shock to technology. So in Danair, you kind of use again our terminology from time series equivalence, right? The shock is epsilon or E within Danair, and A therefore is endogenous. All right, you next define the parameters. if you look it up, right, all those parameters that we have in the utility function, the reduction function, the law of motion of capital, the persistence of the technology shock, that's our parameters. Later, of course, we will want to estimate parameters from the data, but for now, let me just use values that are perhaps not that implausible and then show up probably also in wider context in the literature. The discount factor here put 2.99, the capital share production 2.35, the rate of depreciation 3%, and so forth. Right? So these are plausible values, but not matched to any specific data set. Then you enter the model equations in two steps. First, the steady states. Right? So when you do this exercise to calculate the steady states for all the model variables, you have the answers in the mod file. You can check your work against what is in the mod file. You get the steady states, and then you log linearize around the steady state. I'll talk a bit more about log linearization in the second part of the afternoon, but I'll also, of course, will also want to inform you that what I'm going to have for the problems that for tomorrow is log linearization. Log linearization is per se a first order Taylor series expansion around the steady state in logarithmic form. Why logarithmic form? Right? Because differences in logarithmic form are percentage deviations. So we get everything nice and interpretable as to how much does output after technology deviate from the steady state in percentage. That's why people do linearization or the log linearization. At least that's the primary reason. All right, and then if you look at the equations, well, what Danair claims, entering a model into Danair is as simple as writing it down on a piece of paper. You're the judge on that, right? I enter, for example, our conditional labor supply, a coefficient on consumption, and coefficient on hours worked. I note those here as L. I have that in the notes as N equal to the nominal wage. Then I have the steady state for the oil equation, and so on and so forth. Steady states, and then the model equations, right? Up to and including the equilibrium condition, the productivity shock, all in log linearized form. And just as the model specification has ended, and then I have a number of commands in Danair. What are they going to do? They are going to calculate the steady state and check whether the model is, to the extent that Danair can recognize it, is properly specified. It's going to give us some model diagnostics. We're going to look at that. And then we are going to shock technology. We're going to shock technology with a shock that is equal to one standard error, 0.01, and the stochastic simulation basically will calculate for us impulse responses with respect to that technology shock, and then we can check whether that looks like what I described intuitively after having written down the model equations. Now this is a Danair file, right? And so you cannot just run it in there per se. In the editor tab of MATLAB, I click on the editor tab, you have a run. But you see this run is grayed out. You cannot execute it because MATLAB doesn't recognize it as one of its own. So you need to do a small detour, and that's in my file main RBC, to tell, after some housekeeping here, right, and just giving you the memory and all that kind of stuff, it's just one command. Danair rbc.log. And that MATLAB will recognize. If you have installed Danair, and if you have added properly Danair to the path, as we have discussed, right? Do not be surprised if you just download these two files from the website, put them somewhere onto your computer, open up MATLAB, and try to run this. It will give you error messages. It will not find it. It will not find Danair. It will not find the specific files. You need to add Danair and the directory in which you have these files to the path, as we discussed before. Absolutely crucial. Otherwise, you'll just keep getting error messages. That's a big. But if I have done everything correctly, now I can click on Run up here, right? Various options for that. We can also time it, how long it's going to take to execute it. I don't want to have any of that. I'm just going to click on the button, right? Just run means check, is there any command syntax error, and if there's not, it will execute it and give us the results. That's the meaning of run, not run away, but run the program. All right, so I seem to have done things correctly. I get results, right? So before we look at the graphs, just a brief look at those results within the main command window of MATLAB. MATLAB there is basically, like Stata, but it doesn't have a separate results versus command window. So the results also go in MATLAB into the command window. Don't be irritated by that. So it gives us some information about what it did. It started up MATLAB. It says after starting up MATLAB, it found 8 equations, and it basically says, I have found different types of plots. At this point, we don't care about that. I'll talk to you later about how to solve the model. This is all information on solving the model. Also the eigenvalues that it calculates, all that has to do with the y solution. So we'll ignore that here because I will find it important that we can solve such models and know how we solve them and not treat it as a black box. But for now, for this RBC model, I'll just for purpose of saving a bit of time, I'm just solving everything within the layer. You get some diagnostics on the model that include in particular also decision rules. That we cannot interpret that much right now, how output depends on past gap is not past technology, the technology shock. For us, also much more important than these moments, right? It simulates everything with the technology. Shock set to 1 standard deviation, as we had it, 0.01. It calculates means, standard deviations, variances, correlation coefficients between the different variables. The main thing I want to look at is the graph. All right. So, start here at the bottom. We have a technology shock of magnitude 0.01. Right? We said we want to have a technology shock of magnitude 1 standard deviation. We said that's an deviation of the technology shock of 0.01. So technology is shocked in period 0 at 0.01. It's a first order regressive process. And it returns back eventually to the steady state. Remember, all of these are percentage deviations at the end. So when it returns to 0, it's back in steady state. Technology shock that eventually disappears because it's a stationary area 1, the technology process. So technology, you see after about 40 periods, it's pretty much back in steady state. What did we say? As technology improves, firms produce more. You see here we have more output, produce more, therefore can pay higher wages. Right? We see wages rising in the picture W. Wages go up. So what do people now do when we look at labor supply? They work more because now is a more productive time to work, and they, of course, within this model structure, expectations are formed as mathematical conditional expectations. They know when the shock hits, eventually technology goes back to the steady state. Right, so now is a good time to work, and later you can bum around it. When the technology is again less favorable than it is in the period of the shock, in the very first 2 years after the shock. Right, so this is exactly this intertemporal substitution of labor. You work more when technology is rather favorable in terms of its productivity level, and then you take more leisure when technology is becoming less attractive. And this is exactly this intertemporal substitution of labor, which is eventually will also go back to steady state. Right? It's just not enough periods, but if we kept tracing that, this would eventually go back to zero. Therefore, because you have more labor, that of course also adds to more output produced, right? It's not just that output goes up by exactly what it should go up because you're more productive, but also because you have more labor. What about capital? Well, because they're the same reasoning for capital, right? That if you have a more productive environment, that's the best time to have capital stock, right? So you also see a positive response to the capital stock that diminishes and eventually returns back to the system. This looks M-shaped, and that's one of the reasons also why this model actually had quite a bit of attention. If you measure that empirically, that response is M-shaped, not monotonic, and so that's what the model produces. But for our story, to complete the story, right, you have more capital as well, have a higher compensation for capital, right? Because you're more productive, the firm produces more, it gives a higher compensation both to labor and capital. Right? So also just like wages, the rental rate and capital falls, but then eventually will actually below steady state, and that's where the capital stock comes back down to steady state. But both of those propagations, right, that you have more labor and that you purchase more capital, both of them add to the increase in output. And because you have an increase in output, you consume more, of course you also invest more because capital is in a more productive environment, right? At least for some periods, noticeably above steady state. And that's our set of responses, right? So what you basically see here is you get part of a business cycle. First, output is booming as you have this technology shock, and then that boom gradually works back to the steady state. That's the logic. This is the one shock that is in this model, and the only shock. Right? So all of business cycles must be driven by technology, but we can calculate very precisely what's the magnitude of these responses. And again, the idea is, right, if now some policy change, we don't have yet any monetary fiscal policy in the model, but if it did change, because the parameters are all deep ones, functions, utility, production, those parameters in utility, production, function, one would seem hard pressed to think, why should they change monetary policy? So deep parameters that are policy varying, and so now we can do policy analysis on the basis of such a model as well, as soon as we have brought in policy. And that we'll do after the break. That will go to a new Keynesian DSGE model that at least has monetary policy. So the policy analysis, but of course our purpose is going to use this model in the end to do forecasting. Maybe let me first absorb you that a little bit, and then I'm going to come back after the break that will take you now, whether you have questions on the business cycle model. And then please try to take time a little bit to see whether you have questions to hopefully fulfill on the idea that by going back a step first, relative to the advanced funding macro course, you see the origins of this whole modeling idea. Of course, I understand this is novel, so you may take a little bit of time to think about it, but let's make sure that you're happy with this model structure. Because if you're not, then it's going to be very hard to understand the new Keynesian DSGE model. Because one of the many mechanisms in the new Keynesian DSGE model is this technology shock story. Right? It's only one of several stories. Right? But if you didn't understand this story, you'd not understand what the new Keynesian DSGE model wants to do. It wants to, beyond demand shocks, also have these technology shocks in there. But enrich such a model where all of it is technology shocks by demand shocks as well. All right, so let's take the break. How about resuming, according to this clock on the wall, 5 minutes past 3?